war hero, father of our country, statesman, all words that can be used to describe George Washington. But what about notorious assassin? That's right. Before George Washington became the illustrious leader of the American Revolution and was considered the father of our nation, Washington was indeed an admitted assassin. How so? Washington's journey to being labeled the Lee Harvey Oswald of his day began over 20 years before the first shots at Lexington and Concord, when he was a young, brash military officer in the Virginia militia. In late spring of 1754, a 22-year-old Washington led a group of soldiers through the disputed frontier territory of present-day western Maryland and western Pennsylvania. His goal was to create a military road that could form a route from the Potomac River to the Monongahela River, thereby establishing a direct road to Virginia's claims at the strategic forks of the Ohio, present-day Pittsburgh, and their territory in the surrounding Ohio country. The only problem is the French were also claiming this territory for themselves, and shortly after embarking on his journey, Washington learned of a French military contingent that expelled the small group of Virginians who had set up a trading post at the critical forks of the Ohio. Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie of Virginia, who set Washington out on this mission of building a road, also gave him orders to confront the French and defend the interests of the British and their allies, if need be. One of those allies was an American Indian chief named the Half-King, who was traveling with Washington and would soon convince Washington that the French were an imminent threat to him and his tribe's existence. As Washington entered what is present-day Fayette County, Pennsylvania, the Half-King alerted Washington of a French military force in the area and suggested the Virginian go on the offensive to strike first, before the French could attack them. Taking the bait, the young, naive Washington set out to find this French force in the early morning of May 28, 1754. Washington and his soldiers found a group of about 30 French soldiers sleeping in a secluded cove about 8 miles from their encampment. What happened next is still up to debate. We don't know who fired the first shot, but we know the French were massacred, with the leader of their force personally being butchered by Washington's ally, the Half-King, who had a personal hatred of the French. However, it turned out the person the Half-King butchered, Ensign Jumonville, was traveling with soldiers to deliver an official summons to Washington and his group of Virginians. The summons was a warning to the British, informing that they were trespassing on French territory, as French claimed this area too, and they were asked to leave. So, in effect, Washington's group just ambushed and killed a French diplomatic corps. Washington knew the French would not take this lying down, and a month later, after finishing up his mission to build the road, he got wind of a French military force heading his way to avenge the death of their countrymen. Knowing he had an imminent battle on his hands, Washington constructed a fort of necessity to make his stand. The problem was Washington was a sitting duck. In an open field, he constructed this fort and even lost the Indian ally, the Half-King, who abandoned Washington because the Indian chief even knew he couldn't get out alive. And when the French and their Indian allies attacked, Washington's demise seemed imminent. However, when the French unexpectedly offered the young Virginian the ability to negotiate a surrender, because it turns out the French were having a lot of problems on their side, which Washington wasn't aware of, but young George gladly took their white flag gesture as a way to save his life and his soldiers' lives. But one problem: Washington didn't speak French. Instead, Washington relied on a Dutch translator that was with him, who also spoke French, to translate all communications. After back and forth with the French, the 22-year-old Washington agreed to the terms of surrender in the middle of the night. The agreement allowed for Washington and his forces to withdraw with the honors of war, retaining their baggage and weapons, but having to surrender the fort he built, Fort Necessity, to the French. But It wasn't until shortly after signing the Articles of Capitulation that one clause came back to haunt Washington and embarrass the British. The clause stated Washington admitted guilt in assassinating the French diplomatic officer Ensign Jumonville. Washington vehemently denied this and defended himself, saying that the translation he had been given was not assassination, but instead, quote, death of or killing. But it was too late and the damage was already done. The French had used this as a propaganda tool to whip up sentiment against the British and further justify their efforts to claim more territory in the disputed Ohio Territory. And Washington's reputation took a bit of a hit in London and some at home. Washington strongly disputed this account and instead blamed the Dutch translator who assisted him for the misunderstanding in verbiage, and until the day he died in 1799, Washington always professed his innocence, always professing that he was told he was signing something different, writing in a letter, quote, "We were willfully or ignorantly deceived by our interpreter in regard to the word assassination. I do affirm and will to my dying moment." George Washington's early reputation, could be said, was also lost in translation as well.